My name is Grace Mulcahy. I'm part of the University College Dublin Research Culture team. And it's my pleasure to chair the last session today, which is a panel discussion here. We've got a really good, distinguished panel for you. Now, we all had a quick discussion just before we came in to the panel here, and we decided that because it's been a really long day and the sun is shining outside and you probably all have trains and boats and airplanes to catch, we're trying to finish beyond or before the time that's been allocated to us. So we're all going to talk fast, but we do want to have plenty of audience engagement. So this is your cue and your permission to interrupt us if you don't like what we're all saying or if you want to just get your viewpoint. So talk fast, talk loud, and see how quickly we can get out of here. So by way of introduction for the panel then, I'm going to start at the far end, and we have Sally Smith, and Sally is Director of Research in Trinity College Dublin. She's also co-chair of the Irish chapter of COARA. Next to Sally, we have Seán Lacey from Munster Technological University, and Seán is the Research Integrity and Compliance Officer there, as well as being a really good mathematician and statistician, so we consult him on those elements as well. Next to Seán, we have James Morris, and you met James and will have talked to him and heard his presentation earlier today. And James, of course, is Senior Policy Officer with Science Europe. And finally, Wendy McLoone, who's Director of Research here in the beautiful city of Belfast at Queen's University, Belfast, QUB. So I'm going to start off and ask, first of all, our three of our panellists to give a perspective, first of all from the UK, and then from Europe, and then from Ireland, on the future of research culture work. So I'm going to start off with Wendy and ask Wendy to give us a brief overview of where she thinks the next steps are. And I think I know the answer to this one, and REF might be part of it, in terms of research culture work from a UK perspective. Wendy.
Okay, so thanks very much, Grace. So I guess some of the points that I want to pick up very much resonate with a comment that one of the speakers in the session that I just attended referenced, and he very much encouraged us to be hackers and thieves with regards to what we do around research culture, around interdisciplinary working, around global partnerships. And in that context, I'm going to look to the presentation that Ben mentioned, or the presentation from Ben at the beginning of the day, where he did in fact mention REF and how REF is really very much a pivotal moment in terms of the research culture landscape in the UK. And what happens with REF and how the outcomes of the PCE pilot exercise will very much inform the future of research culture in the UK. But I think that has to be set against the backdrop of the financial situation in the UK HEI landscape, where universities are under a huge amount of pressure. There are staff losses. We'll have to think very differently about where our priorities are around research culture. They may be different from what they were maybe aspirationally 12, 18 months ago, and we'll have to look at what the impact of job losses, what the impact of less internal funding, and what that means for where we can prioritise activities and initiatives around research culture. But I think that's where this network is really important, because we can share, we can learn from each other rather than reinventing the wheel and using resources to repeat and to do the same thing over and over again. So, thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. So I think what we can hear there is that although the financial landscape affecting RPOs isn't the healthiest at the moment, that there is very much a roadmap provided by REF, so that at least will ensure that research culture work is continuing and will be directed, at least for the moment. So I think that's good. And then by contrast, James, I think we heard that we actually don't even know how to translate research culture into the Tower of Babel, into the different European languages. I would love to know, for one, what it is in German, but I guess I'll have to go and ask my German colleagues about that. But again, that shows you the different stage of maturity we are in, I guess, in terms of thinking in a European perspective. So we'd love to get your quick analysis of where you think it might go through the looking glass.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've realised for now working on research culture for 5 or 6 years that there are big differences in maturity in relation to our members, funding and performing organisations working on research cultures, either explicitly or implicitly. So some organisations think about research culture from an open science perspective, while others from a research assessment reform perspective. And our role at Science Europe is to try and accommodate those whilst also defining a shared direction for change across the European research area. So that's one of our priorities moving forward. We're going to continue bashing the drum for shared values. We have that values framework now. We think that's really important. We want to take that beyond the European research area. We work a lot globally. And I think, as Karen said in her previous talk, it's not about imposing values on others, but it's about taking our values, communicating why they're important, and using them as a basis to engage in international cooperation and collaboration. And I think that's really important for the European research area moving forward, particularly with all the political instability that many regions of the world are facing now, and also in terms of the competitiveness agenda that we're seeing that the EU is pushing more and more. I think one of the key messages that Science Europe will be advocating for over this next year will be that, yes, competitiveness is important from a strategic perspective in the EU, but that we can be competitive by offering attractive conditions for talented individuals. So competitiveness through collaboration, competitiveness through openness, and that's something that we think can be a really key message for the European research area moving forward, and a way to balance those different strategic perspectives.
And if you look at the moment at what's happening in Europe and the climate, if you like, in terms of how researchers are treated and the esteem in which they're held as compared with certain other parts of the world, that's instantly a cultural difference, a cultural perspective. So the reality of it is very much taking root. Yeah. Thanks, James. Yeah. So back to Ireland, Seán. So tell us something about how you think research culture has developed and will continue to develop in the research ecosystem in Ireland, which is, I suppose, distinct from the UK, our nearest neighbours, or a European-wide ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. And I suppose, since you did mention the maths and stats, I suppose I have two things in mind here, which so I'll keep it clear in my head. And one, I suppose, would just touch on what Wendy said at the very start when opening up today, was the idea of sharing. So sharing the knowledge. I mean, when you walk around there and you see all the posters, you see there's phenomenal initiatives being in place and I suppose ongoing or even completed. And I suppose it's sharing the learnings from that obviously that's what this network is great for, but it's for us, I think it's our responsibility to filter that down to our own local institutions as well. And also then the second one thought that would come to my mind, and it's something that I think has been touched on by all our speakers today, was the idea of building evidence. And I think that there's such wonderful initiatives there, but I think it's to be, I suppose, conducting research on them as well. Like when we look across Europe, we can see that often you'd have research masters, PhD students are having studies on, say, research assessment, research quality, research methodology, and different things around that. We're not as known here in Ireland for offering a research, I suppose, projects in that area. And I think if we start maybe looking at our funding agencies to try to maybe offer PhDs or research masters in the area of getting more evidence on research culture, research quality, that would really help towards, I suppose, progressing things as well.
Yeah, good. So a lot of work to do, I think, is what you're saying there, and we're just really begun to scratch the surface.
But I think one thing on it, and Steve mentioned it, and someone else mentioned it, was the idea of lag time. Like when we start talking about the research, it's a case we could be starting today, but like we realistically have to be prepared. Look, it's a long journey. We're in for the long haul. That you won't start seeing outputs for 2 or 3 years. But I'd also would say that I think we're in that journey at the moment as well. It's not a case of that we're starting today. I think in Ireland, there's this whole idea of how do you go from good to great. Jim Collins wrote a book, and it was never a case of it was one moment in time. It was over a period of time. And I would think in Ireland that maybe potentially that started in 2017 when we made the National Policy Statement on ensuring research integrity in Ireland. And we've been building from there. So I would personally think that we're in that journey at the moment. We're not starting today, but this network is very much part of that. And I think maybe in a decade's time, when we look back, we will say, well, it's over that period where there was change.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks, Seán. Certainly, we can hold you up to account now when we come back here in 4 years' time and say, has Seán's prophecy come true? But I think a thread right through the conference has been assessment, and I guess, what gets measured gets valued. That's certainly true. And what I would like Sally to address in terms, Sally, of your role as co-chair of the Irish chapter of COARA is how research assessment influences culture, because undoubtedly it does.
Yeah, thanks very much, Grace. And I think what I think is important when we look at the various components of research culture, and there was discussion in the first session about what gets to be in that menu and what doesn't. But what we might think of as commonly within the components of research culture, assessment will interact differently with those components, whether we're talking in terms of whether we're talking about assessment of individuals or assessment of research groups. So research assessment can mean obviously research assessment of individuals, whether it is recruitment or promotion, or of grants, for example, or it can mean assessment of groups, whether it's a unit of assessment and so on. So I think particularly one of the components of what we would consider to be research culture, particularly around EDI, is less tractable perhaps when you're looking at assessing individuals, and more appropriate when you're looking at assessing groups. Having said that, I think there are a lot of the components of research culture agenda where research assessment can be very powerful, whether or not you're talking about individuals or groups. And I think that's, for example, particularly when you're talking about areas like open science, particularly when you're talking about areas like mentoring and research leadership, particularly when you're talking about areas to do with public engagement. I think that those are areas in which assessment practices can be extremely powerful with respect to changing research culture, because it manifestly becomes materially important to people and to groups. So I think that is important. I will say that there are some aspects that I think are very potent aspects of research culture that are much less tractable via assessment methods, and that's often when it comes to behavioural stuff around bullying and harassment particularly, and ethics and integrity. I think assessment practices there are probably less able to change the picture. So I would say, yeah, I think assessment's really important, but it's not universally powerful. And I want to just add one quick thing about, we hear a lot about tick boxing, and as a co-chair of COARA, a lot of what people talk to me about with research assessment is, it's all very tick boxy, or there's a danger. And I kind of want to slightly defend tick boxing, because I think that it can be a not sufficient but necessary precursor, because I think what people think when they think about this is all about ticking a box is that it's not real, right? It's not in the hearts and minds. It's a sort of an empty practice. And I think we all accept that what we want is hearts and minds change. What we want is empty practice. Like if I said, what we don't want is empty practice. Like if I said to you, oh my God, I've just hired Wendy, she's a superstar, you would know that I probably don't mean she's an awesome mentor, right? Or she does great science, open science practices. You would know that I probably mean something about her publication or her H-index or whatever. So we do want, our goal is for hearts and minds to change and that private language and private discourse to change. But I do believe, honestly, that if you look at it through time, ticking the box changes sort of the currency of esteem, which then changes hearts and minds. So I do think we need to not reflect only that sort of policy practice, is necessarily, I suppose, an empty thing.
Good. And I'm going to come back to the audience in a minute and ask you to come back on any of those points, so you have been warned. But just before I do, Sally, we've heard, since certainly our institution became a member of COARA, and talking, others in the research system in Ireland generally, there are dissident voices who say, this stuff is nonsense, What's wrong with the H-index counting stuff? You know, we all did well and it is a real measure of quality. And who has time to read all these narrative CVs anyway? Do you think the dial is changing? Are we beginning to change hearts and minds on that? Or is there always going to be, if you like, a recalcitrant core who will always claim that, you know, this stuff is not really worth the paper it's written on?
I guess I think there's two questions there. One is, will it always be the case? And I can only say, I hope not. One is, where are we in the Irish sector? And I would say it's a very mixed picture. I mean, I do feel that often in the rooms that I'm in, where the discourse is very much about research performance in a very reductive way, this umbrella term of research culture can be important because it seems to capture a lot, but it can then also feel... Stephen Curry had a great quote that people think that we're sacrificing research quality on the altar of warm feelings, and I still feel that where I am sometimes, that remains the case. And this idea of survivor bias, I think, which I heard today in this context for the first time, is really important. Can feel like a hermetically sealed box sometimes, where these people who have all won this competition nod at each other saying there's not really a problem, right? So I would say that in the Irish sector, there are pockets of real understanding and empathy, and yet it is still a mixed picture overall, I would say.
Okay. Anybody like to come in on that, or any questions on any of those points from our audience? Steve?
I'm just going to make one. I'm going to steal that sort of hacking.
Steal the microphone first. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to paraphrase and steal from Max Planck from 1949 and just see if there's a kind of bit of feedback on this. A new research culture does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. So what are your views on the change being driven by the old guard, as you've mentioned, leaving, as opposed to changes of hearts and minds, which is obviously much more challenging?
So who'd like to come in on that? Wendy, for starters?
Yeah, so I think, where do you start? I certainly think from the conversations that we are having in Queen's and, you know, in sort of in the UK sector, it is taking some time to convince the senior professors and etc. that, you know, it's you know, they've grown up and they've succeeded through a particular environment, and so they begin to question, you know, is there anything wrong? However, I think coming back to the ref piece, that's what's starting to, you know, it's being measured. So people then start to reflect on, well, actually, how do we need to change, etc. And often it can take one or two senior individuals to, you know, one apple can then begin to propagate the benefits, etc. So if you can get a few advocates, and we in Queen's have a number of advocates on particular things around, for example, postdoctoral mentoring, an individual who saw how the benefit of a postdoctoral development centre, which she had been involved in the US, brought that concept back to Queen's, and now we have an institutional postdoctoral centre. So if you can get a few advocates who are really beginning to show the power of changing research culture and what that can do beyond the individual to, you know, the cohort, the postdoctoral, the early career researchers.
Thanks, Wendy. Okay, more questions? No? Okay, so I'm going to move on, and I'm going to ask each of our panellists here to talk about maybe what other aspects of the research ecosystem need to be brought into the conversation. I think certainly, James, through Science Europe, you have a really good forum for bringing in the funders, but I'm thinking particularly of the publishers. And if I think of research culture, and one of the things that affects my experience of research culture is, you know, publishers emailing me, telling me my review is 1 day late, 2 days late, or asking me to review papers in areas which have no expertise. Are they sufficiently engaged, you think, in the culture conversation? I think they probably are in some aspects, like research integrity, but I'm not sure if they are in the kind of wider research culture questions.
I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure they are engaged enough in many other aspects of research cultures. As you say, maybe on the integrity side, yes, but on a careers perspective, on the health of research systems perspective, I don't think they are. We have a lot of joint discussions with publishers at Science Europe across our different policy priorities, particularly open science, but also in relation to integrity and career research precarity. I think it's important that we have those discussions with the publishers. They're clearly an important component of our research systems. But it's also important to recognise that many of them have commercial interests that dictate their positions on these topics, and that we need to be careful when we engage with them in that regard. I think that's been one of the ideas around Kawara really being a community-led initiative, that we don't get those commercial interests permeating into the reform movement at the stage where it needs to be really the community voices that we hear most. So we need more discussion with publishers. I think it's worth exploring that across the topics that we think are covered in research cultures. We're having that discussion with them now on shared values, asking them what their values are and how they might be linked or how they might be different from the ones that we've put together and are using to define our actions. But we need to collaborate with them carefully, I think.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking back to one of the results from the UCD Research Culture Survey, which Hugh Fulham-McQuillan in the back there has analysed, and the impact on research mental health of our research culture. And clearly what our researchers are saying is that they feel the research ecosystem broadly exploits their interest and their enthusiasm for the subject. And I can't think of anything more directly linked to that on a personal level than our willingness to do peer review for publishers, which, as you say, are commercial entities, and we do this for free and apparently out of the goodness of our hearts. And there's something wrong, I think, and broken in that system. So maybe that's a topic, yeah. Anybody else? Any reflections on that and engaging other parts of the research ecosystem, Seán?
Yeah, Grace, you just touched on it there with your response there to James. But I suppose one thought that I had, and I attended the Measuring Research Culture Progress session there, and I suppose Elena and Geraldine both mentioned it about the mental health and the well-being. I think that's a key component to research culture, especially for our postdoc students, where there is that contract and they're going from one contract to the other, and there is no security, there's problems with pensions. Like, that speaks to a researcher career framework. And like, that very much is linked to research culture, and I think that's something that we really need nationally, internationally to do work on.
Yeah, okay. More questions, comments? You're all tapped out. So, unless there's anything else, any other specific comments on any of those questions from our audience? Yes, Sally?
I wanted to sort of touch on what Wendy was saying about the importance of REF, right? And obviously we don't have that in Ireland. And I was struck by that comment, particularly with respect to what Karen had mentioned, I think, early in her talk about she'd spoken to a minister who sort of shocked at what had been revealed about research culture and saying, goodness, the public cares about how research is done as much as what is done. And I thought, wow, I mean, A, do they, and B, how does she know? And C, I hope that's true. And I think what's the challenge for us in Ireland is that because we lack, the big stick of REF, which, I was involved with at Queen's myself, and which I actually feel very mixed feelings about, which I think it does drive some of the stuff that we would want to see driven, at the same time being, an extreme example of an audit cultures thing. And how do we get in Ireland as a country, which is still, I think, really starting to think about these things in a new, in a reasonably fresh way, how do we get the good without the bad, and maybe that's not possible. But to me, I think sort of the policy-making bit is very, very powerful in the research ecosystem.
So, yeah, there's Stefan in the front here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just have one question. I really like the idea of research culture. It encompasses so many different things, and it's great that we have an event like this. Just talking about work-life balance, then again, I wonder if these new initiatives actually make work-life balance worse for everyone involved, because there is just then the expectations that in addition to your day-to-day job, you also engage in research culture, public engagement, public outreach, which is often outside of working hours and so on and so forth. So it just gets more difficult to find a job, or if you are on the job market, you have to fulfill those criteria as well. So does research culture make, while it has a lot of advantages, impose even more pressure on researchers?
Yeah. Anybody like to respond to that? Wendy? James?
Well, I guess to speak to that point, one of the pieces of work that we're doing at Queen's at the moment is looking at our academic profiles. So at the moment, research culture doesn't feature as a criteria for reward and recognition or promotion. And what we're doing is we have now four pillars or 4 quadrants, one of which is contribution to culture. And what that seeks to do is to ensure that individuals will be rewarded for research culture, as well as for publications and research grants, all the more what you might consider the traditional measures of reward and recognition, so that if individuals do spend time with whatever that initiative or activity might be, they are getting recognised for that as equivalent to some of the other endeavours individual researchers or academics are engaged in.
Yeah, and I think on a related mark, I think in UCD we already have a category which covers research culture and sort of contribution more broadly. But I think something that is often remarked upon is that the extent to which people engage in those activities is very often gendered. And even though something might be theoretically the same as having your publications in wherever high-profile journals, is there a hidden curriculum underneath that? I think that's.
And I would say we're in the process of refining that. We haven't tested the implementation, so that will be key. And I guess the culture around the implementation and how that's viewed by panels, etc., will be something we need to give significant attention to.
Sure. Yeah.
And if I may, Grace, sorry, it's just because it's related to academic promotion. So at Trinity, there's a review at the moment of senior academic promotions, and also I've been having these discussions as part of a North National Open Research Forum project. And what a lot of people have been saying, particularly reasonably early to mid-career academics, is pushing research culture stuff, including impact and public engagement, into this other category, actually, in practice, is seen to devalue it. And so there's an argument, and I hadn't really encountered it, and I think it's really interesting, from that cohort, which is we want these activities to be seen as research output. So they need to go in the box that your publications would go on. And even though that makes that concept a bit more slippery and maybe not helpfully so, but they were like, in order to get it really looked at and not just put into the nice box of stuff that ladies do, right, to get it seen as a research output per se, is the argument that is being made there, and I think that's quite interesting.
Thanks for that, Sonny. James?
Yeah, I think the message needs to be not that these are all the things that might contribute to research culture change and you as a researcher need to engage in them all, but rather the system allows you as a researcher to have the flexibility to say, I'm best placed to engage in more public engagement activities, or I might really care about open peer review, and I'm valued and I'm recognised for those activities, and I can pick which ones that in my role I think I can contribute most to. So it's not about creating a list that you need to take action on all of them, but rather select which ones you as a researcher think are where you can contribute best.
Hope that makes sense. It does to me. Anyway, yeah. So I guess another thing I said I'd do would just come up with a list of my key takeaways from this meeting. And I'm sure you will have other ones, so I encourage you guys to volunteer, your key takeaways as well. Same to our panel. But some of the things that struck out to me and that I will remember following this meeting is, first of all, it's actually not that easy to define what research culture is, either on a cross-national basis or even among ourselves, and that sometimes I think, although we do need to have maybe a core definition of research culture, it can look different in different kinds of institutions and even in disciplines. I know I often say that in our university we have not just a single research culture, we have proliferation, or whatever the collective noun is for a group of research cultures, because everybody does research differently, be it in humanities or STEM or whatever. So I think that's no harm, and the balance between alignment and diversity in that was referenced, I think, with Ben and Karen in our first presentation today. The other thing which I think came up repeatedly during the day was the importance of co-creation when it comes to the definition or the time to propose interventions or initiatives in research culture. Again, there was a discussion about the balance of centralising a research culture strategy and the diversity which arose from grassroots co-creation. And I think to me it's very clear that a co-creation approach, that what is proposed by the research community is something that the research community will adopt and will find beneficial, but that of course needs to be supported and reinforced by senior leadership and by policy frameworks. So it's that balance, that yin and yang, if you like. And I think the term which was proposed for that would be structured diversity, which I thought was a really, really nice one. I think the description of how the indicators for research culture for the upcoming REF were being developed was a really interesting story. And I think the message I took from that is it can't be rushed, that it was a very slow, deliberative process, but the time taken for that process was really important and would improve the process and was essential to ensure that the process would be robust at the end of time, so that, you know, the journey took time. Also from that presentation, it really resonated with me that the issue of mental health and well-being of researchers came up much more strongly from the research community members themselves than from institutions. And again, I think Hugh and Sonia's work in UCD really referenced that mental health and well-being and researcher well-being is something that is impacted on by research culture. And I think, you know, an analysis of what aspects of research culture support good researcher mental health and which are inimical to it, I think is going to be something really powerful as we go forward. We talked about tick box exercises a lot in various different terms and how we normalize changing behavior. And I think we all realize that culture change isn't something that happens overnight. And probably we need to engage maybe more with behavioral change experts to understand how to change a culture and to change behavior, why people change behaviors, how to make it easier for behavior change to happen, while still imposing conditions and measurements that favor that change as well. The issue, and I've mentioned this before, of translating research culture to different languages struck me as fundamental to our own efforts to express research culture, and something that's, you know, not trivial, but actually really important, and that cultural dimension was really important. And then we talked about maturity frameworks and the fact that institutions should have a reflective approach to their own position in terms of research culture. And it struck me that, okay, maybe this is poking the bear, or maybe it's a silly idea, I don't know, but I was thinking about narrative CVs for researchers. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if institutions were asked to write narrative CVs of their own for their research culture and, you know, produce research culture statements rather than just have it tick boxes of so many of this and so many of the other. So that was what I took from today anyway. So I'm sure I've missed lots of things. Are there any other major takeaways that our panel would like to add?
Sally. One of the things I thought was potentially really fruitful, and it came up in a couple of the talks, was this idea of failure as actually being evidence of research culture success. firstly on the part of research colleagues, which is if they have failed, that means they've had time to be creative and try things. It means they haven't been impelled simply by not failing at all costs, which if that's your one motivation is never to fail, certain things will flow from that. And also failure on the part of institutions and true reflection on and being able to really face where things have not worked or where things have been less than good in the past, and how that actually public sort of not measurement but noting or something of failure is actually a sign of positive research culture. And actually there's a thing in Trinity called failure studies that's happening actually today. I didn't realise it's a whole kind of discipline or subdiscipline, probably very interdisciplinary, but I think that idea of it would be confident, and I think it would be imaginative to think about failure in that way.
It's nothing to be ashamed of to fail, yeah, for sure, yeah, okay. Any other reflections from the audience? Yes, Colleen.
So many of my reflections tallied with yours, Grace, so that's nice, we're on the same page. But I thought I'd mention that I think if you ask institutions to write research culture narrative CVs, it's going to be people like me who have to do that work, and it won't have the reflective effect we might have hoped. And that, I think that is one of the bigger challenges, is how we bridge the gap between those of us who are really committed to changing culture because we see it as positive, and people who need to be committed with us but maybe aren't convinced yet.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks for that. Another question here, Tony.
Hi, I'm Tony Weir, University of Strathclyde. So I worry about hanging too much hopes on REF for solving some of this. So give a perspective that I think that has emerged for me. So REF 2014 made us think a lot about equality and diversity. And as we were working with people in our institutions, you could see light bulbs going on with people, and that had a really positive change. People who never thought about the implications of research for people with difficult protected characteristics, and that was great. So REF 2014 looked fantastic. REF 2021, we'd progressed no further. It was, I would almost say we went backwards in that. So I think hanging too much on REF is really not something that we should be trying to do. And just because I don't want to end on a negative note, I think what's positive, though, is the conversations I've had in this room, the people I've met, the projects that people have been talking about, everybody trying to do something, being open about the issues in their institution and talking about it and trying to fix those. So I think from what I've experienced in the last day or so, then I would say it's good news.
Yeah, really good. And thank you very much for that positive note. And because it's always good to end on a positive note, I think I will call this to an end now. But I do want to finish off by just thanking some of the people whose work I think was essential and without whom this conference could not have happened. So first of all, the entire team here at Queen's University Belfast for being such magnificent hosts and for putting us in this beautiful building and for organising the beautiful sunny weather. My own team in Dublin, in University College Dublin, who did great work as well with Queen's, and truly an example, I think, of meeting of minds and a collaborative culture. So we really enjoyed that, and thank you very much. Thanks to every member of the network for joining and for contributing so proactively today, whether it be through presentations, through posters, through comments, just through attendance. And we'd love your feedback. I'm sure there will be an evaluation going out, and we'd love your feedback. Or if you just want to write to us, email us, and tell us what you liked, what you didn't like about the conference, and what you'd like to see in future events as we continue on our research culture journey, that would be great. But particular thanks today, first of all, to Joanna and Aaron, who were manning the desk outside, the registration desk, to the catering staff, to all of the facilities management staff here. And I will reserve special thanks for Ruth, from UCD and her co-partner in crime, Holly, from Queen's University, who between them essentially made sure that everything happened as regularly as clockwork on the day and put huge work into doing that. So thanks very much, Ruth and Holly. If you're here, can you stand up? Ruth is already standing up. I don't know where Holly is. So thanks a million. You've been brilliant. We'll do it all again next time. And thanks again, Colleen, Wendy, and Chris for all your work as well. Safe home, everybody. Continue the conversation, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.